In this video, we're going to take a look at accessing databases from Java. Accessing a relational database from Java is actually really quite straightforward. We have to set up the connection to the database, and that's going to vary according to the database that we're using. But after we have established the connection, the same Java code is used to work with that database, no matter what database we're using. And that's great because if we decide after a while to change the database that a Java program uses, there's only 2 lines of code to change, and that's the connection code, and the rest of it stays the same. Now there are 2 possibilities for the component architecture. One is to use a set of JDBC classes that are provided by the database manufacturer. If that is not available, then we can always resort to the JDBC ODBC bridge, which ships with Java. If we're going to do that, we'll need to create an ODBC driver on the computer where the database lives, and then we'll be able to do that. But by far the best option is to use the JDBC classes provided by the database manufacturer, and you'll be able to download those from the manufacturer's website. For our database, the classes that interact with the database management system is going to sit between our program and the database management system. So for example, if we want MySQL, then we need to download the JDBC classes from here. If it's Oracle, download it from there. If it's some other database, then do a Google search and you're very likely to find a set of JDBC classes. So to prepare to connect to the database, we will need to import java.sql package. We also need to determine the URL of the database that we want to use. So for example, MySQL is going to have a URL that looks like this, and you put in your database name at this point. If you're using an Oracle database, it will look something like that, but this bit here will be the bit that varies according to your database. And if you're using the JDBC ODBC bridge, then you'll end up with something like this, and that's the ODBC driver name. We also need to load the database driver manager, and that is going to vary a little bit depending on which database you're using. So for a MySQL database, you'll need to load this class here, and the code that you need is what's on screen. For Oracle, it's a different driver, and that's the code that you will need. And for a JDBC ODBC bridge, then we use the built-in driver class that comes with Java, and that again, that's the code that you'll need. After that, there's pretty well no more differences, although there might perhaps be a little bit of a difference in the SQL commands that you use, but otherwise it's all the same from here on. So to connect to the database, having loaded the driver manager, we're then able to connect to the database in this way. So from the driver manager class, we call getConnection, passing in the URL of the database and a suitable username and password. Although if we're doing this for MySQL, you can see that the URL in this example has got a user name already built into that URL. This will return a connection object that we're storing here, and then the database is ready for use. Now, if we're going to query the database, we need a select statement. So we'll set up a string with the appropriate select statement in there. Please note that inside the string there is no semicolon. That's quite important. It won't work with the semicolon at the end. But of course we have the semicolon at the end of the Java statement. And having got our SQL string sorted out, we're then able to call from the connection object, prepare statement, and pass the SQL string in. Because this is a select statement, we will then execute query from that statement object. And you can see that it's actually a prepared statement. We'll talk more about that in a few moments. So that will give us a statement to execute, and it's then executed here. And what it will do is return a result set. So now we need to process that result set. And there's a fairly standard way of doing that. The result set has got a method called next. And what that will do is to check to see if another row is available in the result set for us to load. If there is another row available, rs.next will load that row and return true. If there isn't another available row, next returns false. So we'll use a while loop because typically we will not know how many rows are to be processed. With while, there is one that's available still, load it and then process it inside the loop body. And the way that I'm processing it here, which is very unadventurous, is really just to print to the console an echo of what we've just got from the database. There's the result set. Whenever we want to get an integer, we call getInt. If we want to get a string, get string. If we want to get a double, get double, and so on. And then inside the brackets, as a string, we put the name of the column that we want to access. Please note that you can only access that column once per row. And if you need to use it in multiple places, then at this point, get the value once, store it in a variable, and then you can use it in multiple places within the loop body. Having finished processing the result set, we close it and close the statement, and then we're ready to move on. What about inserting data? Well, here we have an SQL string, and we set up our SQL string in the way that our database would expect. And then we can prepare the statement like we did for the query, but this time, because it's not a select statement, this isn't a query, so we use execute update. And it's important to remember that execute update is used for every SQL command except select, and we use execute query for select. So whether we're inserting or updating or deleting or even creating a table or dropping a table, we will use execute update. And that returns an integer which will tell us how many rows have been affected by the SQL command that we have just executed. With an update, here's a typical update string, and we use execute update having prepared the statement. There's the delete as a string, and then we prepare the statement, execute update, and the deletion is done. Now, the examples we've used so far have had hard-coded values. But what if we want to use variables? In which case, in our prepared statements, we will want to make use of parameters. So here's an example. We are wanting to insert into the club name, some values. And what we're putting here, represented by the question mark, is a placeholder. Having prepared the statement, we are then able to provide a value that will sit in place of the placeholder. These question marks are numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on. Now we've only got the 1, so we only have to provide a value for placeholder number 1. So in that statement, having prepared it, we then set a string for placeholder number 1 and provide a value. Then we can update. Now we can go on and do this in Spring Boot, and the next video will show you how we can do this.